Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, July 5th. Happy 4th of July week, everyone. It is great to be here. We know we have regulars who join us through thick and thin every Wednesday at noon, and we encourage you to check your calendar and block off this time. We are really happy to continue our service of focusing on aspects pertaining to better broadband, better lives. That's our motto here at Broadband Breakfast. We do news and events around broadband infrastructure, big tech, and the impact that broadband has on each of our lives. We just came off from a day-long summit 8 days ago, the Made in America Summit, 4th of July themed topic there. And we've actually just now posted the videos of this event for our attendees who attended the conference, as well as our Breakfast Club members. The Broadband Breakfast Club, for those of you who are not familiar, is our premium product. We do probably 99% of our content is free on Broadband Breakfast, but we do have a way you can get more out of the reliability and information you get from Broadband Breakfast, and that is through our monthly membership program. And part of the benefits you get is access to all of the videos at our events. And it was again quite a summit. We had 5 different sessions on topics ranging from reacting to the BEAD allocations. It was the day after the National Telecommunications and Information Administration announced the awards. We had 3 state awardees there to speak about it from Virginia, New Mexico, and Kansas. And then we had discussions about other aspects of President Biden's domestic policy agenda, including green energy, semiconductors, the way all of these infrastructure items come together, and challenges and complications, quite frankly, in some of the Buy America rules for broadband projects. So these are among the 5 topics that you can see more and learn more as a attendee at the event or as a Breakfast Club member. And speaking of our Broadband Breakfast Live Online events, we're going to be talking about this topic again and again, right? And particularly for this month, it's very fresh off the presses with the NTIA's allocation decisions. We're going to be revisiting some specifics of the numbers that were made, numbers that were previously estimated, and how they came together. That's what we're going to get to just now. Next week, with our colleagues and partners at broadband.money, we'll be doing a webinar later in the day on July 12th, and that will focus on everything you need to know about NTIA's initial BEAD funding allocations. Scott Woods of Ready.net, Dr. Tamara Holmes of Virginia, Ernie Holtree of Indiana, and Joshua Williams of Michael Baker International will be on that session, and I'll be moderating it. And then later this month, or I should say earlier as well as later this month, we're going to be talking in our Broadband Breakfast Live Online sessions on topics including broadband in the territories, right? We talk a lot about states. We want to focus in on Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, some of the other territories, and how they are focusing on this. We're going to talk about our Broadband Breakfast Club report on July 19th. We'll come back to the issue of broadband nutrition labels, which we've visited previously, on July 26th. And then in August, we'll be kind of doing the circuits. Normally, you don't expect to go out on conferences in August, but we'll be at Fiber Connect in Orlando on August 16th and at Mountain Connect in Denver on August 9th. So those are some of the events you can look forward to in coming Wednesdays at Broadband Breakfast Live Online. And finally, I want to give a shout out to the sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Live Online programs. We appreciate the help and support of Utopia Fiber, Broadband.money, Comcast, Nokia, the Comlog Group, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Michael Baker International, Positron Access, and the California Emerging Technology Fund. Thank you to our sponsors. Well, with that, let's go ahead and introduce our three panelists. We have three, even though you only see two of them on your screen. One of them is going to be audio only, but we are very excited to welcome each of them here to take turns in talking about the numbers games, right? So, for example, Michael Darg, I apologize for not checking. Is that how you pronounce it, Michael? Thank you for being with us. Michael's the vice president at Cartesian, which is a leading consulting firm in the telecom and digital media sector. And Cartesian has gotten a lot of attention recently for its projections and analyses of these awards, the BEAD awards, Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment. So we're going to talk a little bit about what Cartesian projected and how well you did. How do you grade yourself, Michael, right? And Michael's going to be followed by Brian Hurley. Brian is the Chief Regulatory Counsel at ACA Connects, America's Communications Association. And Brian oversees and coordinates ACA Connects advocacy on legal and regulatory matters, as well as educational programming for its members. And he's been an attorney at the FCC previously. And then our third panelist, who you can't see, but you will be able to hear, is Will Reinhardt. Will is a senior research fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunities, and he specializes in telecom, internet, data policy, and has done some really fascinating number crunching around this topic and others. And so let's go ahead and open it up to our three panelists. We're going to try to bring in some other perspectives. We've actually done a good bit of reporting on this on Broadband Breakfast, and encourage you to check this out, including a piece just last week by our reporter Tara Lynn Whipple on how did NTIA's allocations of BEAD funding compare with prior predictions, and that was published 5 days ago. Encourage you to check that out. We'll put the link to that in the notes for this event. But anyway, let's go ahead and turn to you, Michael. The floor is yours to tell us a little bit about Cartesian and how you've been looking at the BEAD funding allocations.
Thanks very much, Drew. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm joining from close to London, England. You probably hear from my voice. Cartesian's an international consulting firm. Our strategy business is based in London and in Boston. And I work with my colleagues in Boston a lot on broadband-related issues, and particularly BEAD over the last year or so. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cartesian, we're a business and technology consulting firm. We specialize in the communications sector. And most of our work is we're basically helping clients to achieve their strategic goals. And in the broadband space, that's generally about helping people connect more people, and for service providers, helping them to expand and grow their businesses. In terms of the study that we did on BEAD, I think, we were working with ACA Connects, and Brian's going to follow me and he'll be able to speak a bit about the origins of this project as well. But I think early on in BEAD, we recognized that states had quite a formidable task ahead. There was a lot of uncertainty about how much money everybody would get, and what they could do with that money from the federal funding. And so we set about creating this framework to help people think through these issues. And Cartesian has a lot of experience in network cost modeling and building business cases for fiber expansion. And so we took that expertise to, as I say, create a framework, thinking through how much, through some analysis, looking at how much money each state was likely to receive, how much, what it would cost to close the broadband gap in each state, and then thinking about some scenarios about how states could spend that money to, following the NTIA guidance to prioritize fiber, how far could they get with building fiber out in their state or territory? So it's a three-step process. There's some detailed slides available on the ACA Connect website that I encourage people to look at if you haven't already, which will take you through this methodology in a bit more detail than I can today. But essentially, we It was a three-step process. We started off looking at the number of eligible locations, and our data sources for that were the FCC map data. We didn't want to just think about the number of locations that would be used in the funding decision, the allocation decision. We also wanted to project ahead how many locations would actually need to be built to, because we recognize that there's going to be an ongoing build program through other subsidy programs, but also some commercial build over the next year or two until shovels hit the ground with BEAD. So there was an estimation around the number of locations. We then looked at how much BEAD funding everybody was likely to get following the allocation methodology, which is in the NOFO, using our estimate of locations as an input to that, and also thinking about where the high cost money would go. And then finally, as I said, building these deployment scenarios, looking at the cost to serve the unserved and underserved locations in each state, looking at how far each state could get to completely closing the gap, and bringing in some concepts like the provider match. How much do we think providers were likely to contribute to the BEAD dollars, and also the extremely high cost per location threshold, which is it's another dimension of the BEAD program which states will need to think about. So bringing that all together for each state, we produced a short presentation which set out how much money we thought they would get, how much money we think they will need, and then based on that, what their options were for funding broadband to close the gap.
So thank you, and thanks for being brief in your summary. But at the same time, Michael, how did you line up? Like, what were how would you grade yourself? What percent variation did you find in the 56 projections you made?
Yeah, sure. So I think we were pretty happy. I think for about half the states we were within about 1 or 2%, which I think is really good considering the data that we had, which moved over time. We were using, I think we downloaded the FCC map data 3 or 4 times, as it was being refined and in the background. There were some outliers. There were some states where we overshot, and some ones where we undershot. But by and large, the majority, I think we were pretty happy about. In terms of some of the outliers, the territories, we definitely did less well in the territories. They got more funding than we expected, and I think that's partly due to the lack of reliable data that we had about the number of locations that needed to be served in those locations. It changed quite a bit in the final days of the project. So and we've seen some movement since as well. So but it's very interesting now the numbers have been published to look back and see how they evolved and where we landed.
Well, great. Let's turn it over to you, Brian. If I'm understanding correctly, ACA Connects commissioned the report from Cartesian. Is that correct? Tell us a little bit about ACA Connects, your focus on the BEAD program, and this study in particular.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Drew, for the invitation to be here today, and to the entire Broadband Breakfast team. It's great to be here with my colleague, Michael from Cartesian, and it's been a great partnership working with him and his team to develop and continue to refine this BEAD study. I'll start with a little bit of background on ACA Connects for anyone who doesn't know about us, but we're a trade association. We represent about 500 small and mid-sized providers of fixed wireline broadband service. And delivering broadband to rural communities is at the core of what our members do, and they're continually upgrading and extending their infrastructure in rural America. Nearly all of our members provide service to at least one area of the US that's considered rural, and our members increased gigabit service availability in rural areas by nearly 100% between 2019 and 2021. And while the vast majority of our members' connections have been funded through private investment, our members also participate in government deployment programs such as RDOF. So, given our members' focus on serving rural communities, in their existing service footprints, they're well positioned to participate in the BEAD program, and they have a vested interest in ensuring that we take full advantage of this unprecedented opportunity to close the digital divide. And that's really what this BEAD framework is all about. The intent is to give states and territories a head start with their planning. The first version of our study we put out last year, and we've kind of continued to update it to help the states in carrying out this monumental undertaking. And we were looking for a partner to help us with this undertaking and developing the study. We naturally turned to Cartesian. We have a long-term relationship with Cartesian going back many years. They've helped us in a number of projects where they've helped us develop sort of data-driven reports and information to inform policy proceedings on the Hill, at the FCC, and now at NTIA and in the states through the BEAD program. I share Michael's assessment. I think we did do a very good job overall with our predictions. And we've, as I mentioned, we've continued to update the framework over time as new data comes in. And in fact, we're working up a version 3.1, so to speak, that will include the actual allocations factored in. So stay tuned for that. But I want to just kind of close by emphasizing one thing that Michael touched on, which is that the allocation estimates are really only one part of our study. We also estimate the numbers of unserved and underserved locations that will ultimately be eligible for BEAD funding, and we provide guidance to each state on how they can use their allotted funds to bring service to each location. Because remember, broadband deployment is a moving target. Between now and the point when the BEAD funds start actually getting awarded in the different states, we'll continue to see build out to unserved locations, as well as new commitments to deploy broadband under other federal programs. For instance, the Treasury Department recently announced that 42 states had been allocated funding under the Capital Projects Fund. That's a $10 billion program. That 42 state allocation amounted to about $7 billion of that. And those funds were estimated to reach just shy of 2 million locations. And I believe since then, some additional states have gotten their money, and the number of locations will continue to increase. So taking all of this into account, our study concludes that there should be ample BEAD funds available to connect the vast majority of unserved and underserved locations with fiber to the premises technology, which is the preferred technology within the BEAD program. And that's great news for rural Americans in these communities who will get access to the same superior and reliable broadband performance as those who live in more populous areas. Of course, there's a lot of work still to be done. States and territories face a lot of important tasks and decisions in the months and years ahead. We'll be paying especially close attention to the state and territory challenge processes that they're required to implement under the statute. And sort of we'll be encouraging states to ensure that they uphold the primacy of the FCC map, and that to make sure that the money is actually going to the locations that are truly unserved and underserved, so that the money can go as far as possible. But we intend to be there every step of the way, providing states and territories with whatever we can do to be helpful as they carry out this critically important work.
Thank you, Brian. Let's now turn to our additional panelist, and we are happy to have Will Reinhardt, at least in voice, if not in video.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your reaction, Will.
Yeah. Thanks, Drew. First off, for having me today, and like first off, I would say thanks for taking the audio version of this, because I am actually in rural America right now. I'm in Monrovia, Indiana, headed back to DC after spending time with my grandmother in rural Illinois. And as somebody who comes from rural Illinois and who actually does care a lot about what's going on and how states and localities and the federal government allocates a lot of this money, a lot of my research has focused over the years on rural economics and rural broadband. And just first and foremost, I'm in a slightly different space than the rest of the group, right? I am in I'm an academic economist. I work with students on various papers, and so a lot of what I've been doing over the last couple of years is a little bit more in the academic realm rather than the pure applied realm of where the rest of my panelists are working. And within that, I'd like to just say a couple things about the overall BEAD program. First off, I hate to be on my hobby horse on this one, but my worry about this program in particular is that the process, we're at this critical point in the process of allocation, right? We now have a sense of where all the money is going to. And I know that everyone here on the call, but also in the panel, has been working very closely with states and the federal government to make sure that those areas that are underserved and unserved and underserved are getting the allocations they need. My worry broadly about this program has been that the process kind of has gone backwards. So it's now a year and a half later, and now we have a sense where the money is going, instead of starting and beginning with the moment that we're at right now, right? That when you think about actually designing programs, you kind of want to determine what the goals should be. And then obviously then you say, okay, we have X amount of people that are underserved. We have X amount of people who are unserved, and we're going to allocate X amount of money to get those people connected using the kinds of tools that Cartesian and a lot of the other folks on the call have been working to develop. And so I guess just personally, as somebody who cares a lot about process, and perhaps process doesn't matter as much in this because we're getting people connected, but that to me, fundamentally, I just worry that we're not thinking critically about how to properly do these processes, and that if we do have this opportunity at some point in the future to ensure that the very absolute last people are connected, that we ensure that we actually do that. And I've got criticisms and I think methods of actually dealing with that in the future, and we can kind of talk about that if we'd like. But broadly speaking, when we first started this process back in 2021, as BEAD was being talked about, I went ahead and actually made an estimate just using FCC numbers at the time. And again, those are, as we know from the Form 477 data, it's an 18-month delay. And so my estimates back then were, obviously had their biases, had their problems. But one of the things that I think is really, really interesting in comparing my older allocation tables, and again, this is before the NOFO, this is before the specifics of the program really came through. One of the things that I really noticed is that there, in comparing my old estimate, what may be called kind of just a rough estimate from FCC numbers, as compared to what we have now with the updated maps and updated sense of where individuals actually exist. The big thing that I've noticed between this is obviously Florida got a lot less money than I expected. I think that it was pretty significant. It was actually by billions of dollars. I'd suggested that they were actually going to get a lot more money, that they were going to get something like $2.5 billion, and their final estimate came in at about 1.2, if I recall correctly. So it was a difference of 1.3 billion. And then broadly speaking, it seems that this, the lowlands South, or the lowlands, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then into Alabama and Mississippi, had a lot fewer, or had their final allocation numbers actually came in a lot lower than what I expected it to come in. And in fact, some other areas that I expected to have higher, or to have much different allocations also kind of shifted. And I'll send a link within the chat here shortly, comparing these two. I created a map that shows the comparison between these two allocations. But broadly speaking, I think when you compare where we are today as compared to a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, the biggest difference is that the regions, particularly within the Midwest and the Mountain West, tended to get a lot more allocation than I expected. And that California had slightly less, but that I was really surprised that there wasn't more funding that came through to Florida, to Georgia, to Alabama, to Mississippi, into South Carolina. Again, we can talk about this, and I think that it matters a lot how these obviously how the NOFO came through. But I think that this is obviously this is an important place that we're in with the allocation funding. And I and a lot of other groups have been working closely with states to figure out the next steps for this. And so that's really where my attention has been focused on, is really figuring out where these funds should be put, and also working very closely with states as well to figure out the best way to actually, to try to give data to researchers like myself who don't have as fine-grained data, working with localities, but they want to help with the overall process. And so I'll leave it there, but I'm also, for anyone that's on this call, I'm interested in working with them and trying to figure out the best ways to actually use these funds, and then also to set up programs that work in the future and ensure that the most rural areas are connected.
Thank you. Thanks, Will. And I was praising you for being, all panelists, for being willing to put some numbers out there. You put some numbers out there more than 18 months ago, right? And so let's kind of, again, look at this, grade ourselves. We also had other and we have reported on, I guess, another group, the Advanced Communications Law and Policy Institute, New York Law School, and also Mike Conlow, who's done a lot of great data analysis. I want to just let's go to some specific states, and you all have mentioned some, and I'm not sure if we can do this comprehensively, but we can at least spur on some valuable discussions, like who kind of won and who lost and why. And one point that we've received from Mike Conlow was that there were some big misses in the rural states from some of the estimates: Iowa, Nebraska, North and South Dakota. I think that was mentioned briefly. This is from Mike Conlow. This is likely due to NTIA allocation money to only high-cost locations in high-cost areas. So that's one point, and I want to get the reaction of all three of you on this. And also a second point, this is again from Mike Conlow. He says Michigan was low in the estimates because of some fixed wireless filings that reduced the number of unserved broadband locations by 72,000 from the first version of the National Broadband Map to the second. So again, I don't know if you want to address any of these specifics, but let's at least get some clarity on what do you think led to, certain states being disappointed either negatively or conversely, getting better results than they might have anticipated. Let's go in the same order we started. Michael?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the high cost of funding it's a really interesting topic, and it definitely accounts for some of the differences between Cartesian's projections and the numbers that came out from NTIA. And I think as Mike Conlow had written, we saw similar things. So states sort of in the Great Plains area off towards Mountain West, they did less well than we had expected. So we expected more high cost funding to go towards some of those states than actually did. As of now, we don't know the methodology that NTIA used to award the high cost funding amounts. The approach that Cartesian had taken, we've got a cost model that we basically costed fiber deployment across the whole of the US, and we top sliced that and chose the top deciles, the top 10% of locations as being the high cost locations. Clearly, that our numbers didn't line up with the NTIA's approach, and we're really looking forward to understanding a bit more about how that worked out. Where the money did go.
Do you have a hypothesis about why you didn't get those same numbers that they did?
I mean, I think there's, there are a number of possible explanations. I mean, I think it may not have been purely done on, if you like, it may have had something to do with the area that the locations were in, as well as the cost of serving them. So this point that Mike makes about high cost locations, high cost areas. One state that did do well, though, was Alaska. So we had lowballed Alaska, and they got a lot more high cost money than we had expected. And, and we had heard particular issues around Alaska. So I think that, that's probably some, improvement in the, as things had gone on, some refinement has gone on to to make sure people get the right amount of money. But it was our model is we're outside in. We don't know exactly how the NTIA was thinking about this, but looking forward to finding out more.
Brian, did you want to weigh in? You were starting to say something as I was.
No, I mean, not surprisingly, my perspective is pretty close to Michael's on this. I mean, maybe one thing that may be worth clarifying, just in case anyone isn't aware, the reason why we keep talking so much about high cost locations is that there's a statutory formula that NTIA had to follow in making the allocations among the states and territories. And each state and territory started out with a minimum allocation that they sort of get automatically. And then there's a portion that's based on the share of unserved locations. And then there's a portion that's based on the proportion of unserved high cost locations. So how NTIA sort of implemented that high cost standard has an impact on how much each state gets at the end of the day.
Well, we have a question from Mike Wendy. Sorry to jump in. He's asking, so the NTIA's high cost reasoning is walled off from our understanding. I think you're probably answering that, Brian, by saying that there is some number dividing high cost. Say that again, Brian, or restate your point again in responding to Mike's question there.
Well, it's just that there's a portion of the, and I don't have the numbers, but there's some portion of the 42 billion that's allocated on the basis of the share of high cost unserved locations that the state has. And NTIA had to, give some meaning to high cost. So they, in making their allocations. I don't think and to answer the question, I don't think we have visibility, at least not yet, into exactly how they did that. But, we're still kind of examining the new data that we coming in, and we may learn more. So
in other words, it's not just a numerator / divider, right? There is some other tweak where you have to have a certain number of high cost. Is that what you're getting at, Brian? Yeah,
that is one that they're like the money is like split into like 3 different buckets. And one of the buckets is you get a share of that based on numbers of high cost locations in your state. And high cost is a term the NTIA had to sort of give some meaning to what is a high cost location. So
Michael,
I was just gonna add to what Brian was saying. So it's a 10% of the 42 billion. So 4.2 billion is reserved for these high cost locations, and the NOFO isn't specific about what the definition of a high cost location is, and it's something for the NTIA to determine. We don't know yet what process they went through to identify the criteria for identifying a location as high cost. What we have been able to do, though, is to reverse engineer how much funding each of the states got out of that 4.2 billion pool, but we don't know the method that the NTIA used to determine that allocation. And then the lion's share of the money gets allocated purely on the number of unserved locations, which has been published now, the numbers that the NTIA used. And as Brian said, there's a minimum allocation as well. So there's these 3 pots.
Got it. 100, just to be clear, 100 million to every state. It's up to about 5 billion, and so that's 5 billion of the 42.5. Then there's a 10% of 42, or another 4.2 billion, which is going to this high cost. And we just don't quite know the exact yet number of cost of high cost by which that criteria is determined. And then the bulk of it, the rest of that, the whatever that is, 30-ish billion is numerator by denominator, right?
Exactly, and it's interesting that the money largely follows the unserved locations, because a lot of states have many underserved locations as well, but they don't get any additional funding for those. So the states that have perhaps done best out of this are the ones that have a high mix, sort of high component of unserved within the and underserved. If you've got a small number of unserved but a lot of underserved, you're only going to get the funding allocation for the unserved, so you have to stretch that money further.
We're going to come back to the underserved. Will, thanks for waiting here. I know you wanted to weigh in on this point. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to be very, very clear. So in this, and Michael also kind of, hinted at this and talked about this very explicitly, but within the statute, there's obviously no definition of what actually high cost areas means. And that's all I was going to point out is that this was an interesting addition within the overall conversation that, at least on my end, when I was initially doing some of these, when I was initially doing my estimates of what this would look like, this came from the effectively just assuming that the allocation would be done through the unserved. So you would get an initial, 100 million for each of the states and territories, and then you would split it within the unserved. The high cost addition was actually an interesting sort of thing that came in later within the conversation in Congress. So that's also part of at least one thing I would mention, which is, that Congress itself kind of had an idea of what it wanted to do, but it never explicitly said within the statute, high cost is X, and this is what, this is obviously there is a funding allocation for the 10%, but that specifically Congress did not say what high cost should be. And that I think is still something that we're still trying to grapple with in other programs as well, not just here within BEAD, but it's, this obviously implicates a lot of other programs that are being funded at this sort of level.
We want to encourage questions or comments, and we've got one from Steve Ross of Broadband Community. So it's a bit of a long one, but I'm going to read it anyway. He asks, in the southeastern states, rural areas tend to have counties where the USDA's dominant economic activity is vacationing retirement rather than agriculture, mining, et cetera. Population growth in each state has been generally above the US average, but the growth has been in urban areas. Rural counties have had more of a hollowing out since 2000 and 2010 censuses. So he's making the point about secondary effects that may account for this, because again, what I guess the takeaway point is South did not do as well as expected. Midwest did better than expected. What accounts for that? And Steve is maybe suggesting that other things like Southern Bells being early with fiber and other things may account for this. Any reactions, Michael or Brian or Will, to this point that Steve Ross has made here? Why did Florida do poorer? Texas did quite well. The number one state at 3, what's the specific number here is really eye-dropping. Texas is 3.3 billion for Texas. Other big states like California, only a third of that, or maybe 30%, 1.8 billion. And then we've talked a little bit about Florida's low number, not quite as much as might have been in Alabama, Mississippi, and yet Midwest seems to be doing better. Any further thoughts on this kind of regional and what we can learn from this, if anything?
So Drew, I mean, based on our numbers, most for both Texas and Florida, I mean, by far the majority of their funding came through the so-called remaining fund. So this pro rata allocation for the number of unserved locations. So what you're seeing there is Texas just had a huge number of unserved locations within the FCC map. I think the final number was about 780,000 versus Florida, which was about 270. So I mean, let's say roughly a third of that. And then Texas also got a bit of a bump on the high cost locations. So about 8% or so of Texas's funding is coming through this allocation we're talking about from this pool of high cost, whereas Florida didn't get so much of that. So you can understand, I guess the allocations through the numbers. Once you look at the unserved count, then it all becomes pretty clear. I think Mike, going back to Mike Connor, he made an interesting point though a few weeks ago that there were a number of locations in the FCC map, specifically within Texas, that he questioned whether they were really broadband serviceable locations, because they appeared to be, I don't know, barns or things, just structures in the middle of nowhere that people weren't living in. So I think that I'm sure a lot of people have some question marks over still over the some of the quality in the fabric which underpins the map.
You want to say anything on this, Will or Brian?
The one thing I would mention.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that. The one thing I'd mention is that at least this, I think, also speaks. This I think also speaks this difference, or at least as I noticed the difference between, as I said, the lowland South as compared to the Midwest into the West. I think this also speaks to with all due respect to the FCC, how bad some of the initial FCC Form 477 data was, and that the estimates, at least that I was working on back then, are not markedly different, but they're pretty significantly different than what we're talking about now. So I still need to go through and actually do all those calculations and try to figure out exactly the difference between what the old version of the FCC would estimate, and then what the newish, obviously what the final allocation numbers would come in. But with Florida and Georgia, there were actually pretty significant differences between the number of people who were projected to be unserved and underserved within those from back when we started this process. Which the rule point, I think, is also it kind of comes into a very interesting sort of thing that's going on here as well. Is that this is related but separate in some of my research. Some of the things that I actually figured out in some other research regarding rural areas is that, generally speaking, areas that are that have recreation, that are defined as recreation. So this is related to the ERDS data that comes through the rural survey and the rural atlas. That's probably one of the best ways to actually to parse some of this data. But they split, basically, if I recall correctly, every single rural county into five different potential dominant commercial activities, and one of them is recreation. The others being farming, and then mining, and I believe the other one is like government, and then there's a third one I'm kind of forgetting. I think it's just kind of a general. But the point being with all of this is that, at least in previous research, I found that those areas that actually are more recreationally based tend to have slightly better broadband as compared to specifically mining operations. Actually, as I found, tend to have among the worst broadband opportunities, or typically have deployment that is not particularly great. And farming actually tends to have slightly better than what you would expect. So it's kind of also an interesting sort of wrinkle in the traditional story. But at least to me, I'm also excited with all of this. That now that we actually do have these allocation data and allocation tables, and now we actually have the last 6 months, there is a whole bunch of research that can come from this that we can start spooling off. And I'd say that one of the big things that is probably not appreciated, I know it's probably appreciated among people within this group, but it's not appreciated very widely, is that there's very few people that are actually doing the academic research in rural broadband. There's obviously some good people working on it, but for as much money as we are spending, which is about $90-some billion for broadband connectivity writ large and during the COVID years, that allocating it and figuring out where the best dollar should be going to and who it's being directed to, that a lot of that work still has not been done. And I'm actually very excited in the next effectively the next year to start parsing this and looking at it at a much more fine-grained level. And I think that all of the efforts from everyone who's on this call is gone a long way to actually trying to eventually solve this problem. I mean, obviously it's very practical, but from a little bit more of an academic perspective, I think it's actually a very important thing that everyone here has done.
Thank you for lending that additional insight and clarity into kind of the rural areas, the rural communities. We have more questions, keep them coming, but I do want to come to this other point about underserved. Okay. And Michael, correct me if this is kind of a different study or the same one, but I think you had something that reported that the funds that are being deployed are, quote, sufficient to make broadband service available to all eligible locations. And by that, you're saying not only all unserved locations, but some or some percentage of underserved locations. And understanding that this is a really, in my mind, problematic definition, because a lot of things are getting counted as underserved because of claimed service levels that are simply don't pencil in, if you do the speed tests and you do repeated speed tests and you still don't have consistent 100 by 20, right? So I want to kind of come to this point of like, are we going to get all quote unserved locations? What percentage of underserved locations will we be getting? Michael and Brian and Will, I'd love your thoughts on that. And obviously we'll get other perspectives on that too, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, based on our study, we expect that it will be possible to get high-speed broadband to the vast majority of locations, both unserved and underserved. It won't be fiber everywhere. And
what is the percent when you say the vast majority? What percent of underserved will be able to get fiber to them?
I'm sorry, I don't have the number to mind. But I can check back when Brian's speaking. Yeah, I think some of it will be fiber, some of it will be fixed wireless. Some states will be able to do fiber everywhere. Others, they'll be using fixed wireless to fill in where where they need to. I mean, it's the BEAD allows states to use money for programs beyond access as well, and there's some states will have plenty of money for affordability programs and other things like that. So it's I mean it's it's the funding formula is pretty clear, but the way that it's played out for some states is clearly a lot better than for others.
Brian, what are your thoughts on this underserved issue?
Yeah, I'll just build off of Michael's comments and also anticipate one of the questions that came into the chat box, which is sort of the different technologies that we'll use to deploy service under BEAD, and how much of the money will go towards fiber, and how many locations will have to use other technologies that are less expensive, such as fixed wireless. And based on our study, the overall message is that there should be sufficient funds to get fiber to the majority of locations overall. And fiber is the preferred technology within the BEAD program. The NOFO creates a fiber preference. The states are required to set a extremely high cost threshold, and below that threshold, they have to prioritize fiber projects. Above that threshold, they can consider other technologies. As Michael was indicating, it will vary quite a bit from state to state. Some states will have a surplus and they'll be able to get fiber everywhere and have money left over for other uses. Other states don't have that level of funding. They'll have some tougher choices to make. They'll have to use other technologies to get to at least some locations. But overall, it's the allocations should be sufficient to realize the overarching goal of the program, which is to get fiber out broadly into areas that don't have it today.
I want to, before Will, I want to get you in here, but I think, and we reported on this in one of the links I sent here, that your Cartesian's study found that 64 billion will be enough to connect 7.4 million locations. And then you also came up with a overall average cost per underserved location is estimated to be 10,797 and 13,129 for unserved locations. Could you just explain that? Have I correctly correctly cited you, Michael?
Yeah. So the average numbers, they're the numbers in the report. Obviously, there are some locations which are very expensive, which drag those averages up. And as I mentioned earlier, we're expecting that there will be some incremental build between now and when the BEAD dollars kind of hit the road, or the shovels get going. So I think by the time that the construction starts, we expect about 7.5 million, 7.4 million locations requiring coverage at that point. So yeah, I think with the BEAD money and the provider match and match funding from anywhere else, I think you get to a point where you can you can cover the vast majority of these locations. High 90s, definitely.
Right. And so again, I guess maybe an average is not very useful. I don't know if a median is a better number, or whether we need to get a median number for each state, right? Do you have that? Is that part of your?
We do, yeah. So we've provided in the reports which are on the ACA website. We've got cost curves for each state, which show the sort of cost by decile in each state, so you can see what the median location is there.
Will, do you want to weigh in on the unserved versus underserved numbers here?
The only thing I would add is just, that the cost curve, I think, is probably the most interesting of all of this. Is that, if I recall correctly, one of the more recent versions of the Cartesian map basically kind of kicked out some of the cheaper allocations, or I think this is the most recent paper that came out a couple months ago, if I recall. There's been a lot of data that's come out in the last couple of weeks that I've been trying to go through. But I would just say that the cost curves, I think, are the most interesting thing that we still, having understanding this through a cost curve instead of average versus median, I think is probably the proper way to understand actually how you're allocating this money. And it's still, we're still trying to figure out what that looks like for obviously there's a lot that's been done by the FCC, but fundamentally, I think we're just at a very different place. There's other things that I would add to this conversation, but we can wait for later. I still wonder how.
Go ahead and add them now. Go ahead and add them now, William. Will.
Yeah, the one thing I wonder how inflation. I know we haven't really. I know you've been talking about inflation in other contexts, Drew, but I wonder how inflation is going to affect these things as they eventually get put into the ground. I know that we're actually still pretty. The input levels, or the last time I looked at the inflation numbers from the census. Admittedly, it is the census and it has a little bit of a delay, but those are still pretty high. And I do wonder how that's going to affect, obviously deployment numbers at the end of the day. And then finally, this is something that within Utah, since my organization is based in Utah, this is something that we've been talking a lot with local folks in Utah is, again, there's the inflation numbers. How does that eventually affect eventually affect the number of allocations, the number of households that are eventually served. So I think that's still kind of an uncertainty, even though I think we should expect that it is probably going to slightly make it a little bit more difficult. But I would defer to the other panelists because I know they have much better detailed data on the cost curve.
Well, quick response on inflation. These numbers you're putting out, again, averages, let's throw them out, but just cost curves. Are these how good are these numbers? How long will they last? Because inflation is definitely higher than average in this industry, is it not?
Yeah, it's so we have thought about inflation in the modeling, but you're right. It's certainly in recent times it's ratcheted up quite a bit. We've also been looking at in a separate study. We've been looking at the workforce side of this. That's another huge component. Where are we going to find all of the technicians to splice all of this fiber?
Right. Let's move to one last topic area, which is kind of the policy and where we go from here. And we haven't on this discussion had a lot of focus on the state broadband officers, although we have in other contexts. And as I mentioned, last Tuesday at our event, we had state broadband officers from Virginia, from New Mexico, and from Kansas talking about the on-the-ground issues they're considering. So I'd like to invite each of our panelists to weigh in on, where we go from here. Obviously, one big issue is the challenge process, right? And the NTIA has given, in fact, last week, they updated their guidance on the challenge process that involved. And we didn't really dwell much into this thus far, but one of the points that I made, courtesy Mike Conlow, was the way numbers in states changed because particular locations came back, were bumped from unserved to underserved, and hence out of that, numerator number. So I would just kind of ask each of you, what are your thoughts on what state broadband offices should or should not be focusing on as they look at their numbers, as they design their processes, as they look at their own maps, which may have additional information that fleshes out whether something is in fact actually unserved or underserved. Your thoughts. Again, let's do the same order. Michael, Brian and Will.
Sure. So the challenge process is definitely key. I think the other thing which the states are going to have to get their heads around pretty quickly is the extremely high cost per location threshold, which is a line in the sand that each state needs to set, and has some pretty important implications for funding decisions. So for locations which sit below that threshold, there's a requirement to prioritize fiber. For locations which are above that threshold, the states can look to other technologies. Each state's going to be different. Each state's going to be wanting to make that decision based on, the cost curve, but also how much funding they've got and what their policy goals are. Do they want to achieve a high fiber penetration, or are they prepared to trade some of that for other ambitions? So I think it's a very complicated space, because there are a lot of dimensions, and as for another one is also how much they think providers will be willing to match in each of these locations.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just build on some of what Michael said. I just procedurally, what states have to look ahead to is, now that the allocations have been made, they have to put in their initial proposals within 180 days. So, by the end of the year, essentially. And as part of that, one of the big pieces will be sort of laying out their challenge process. And that has been an area of major focus for ACA Connects. The challenge process is an important part of the overall program. It's part of the statute and the NOFO. But at the same time, you have Congress in passing the Broadband Data Act and directing the FCC to develop the broadband map. But it designated that this FCC broadband map should be the authoritative source for identifying locations that are unserved or underserved, for purposes of the BEAD program and for other purposes as well. And we know the map has flaws. But those continue to diminish with each round. And remember, the maps that will be used to actually award the funds will be a few maps down the line from where we are now. So we expect there'll be continued incremental improvements. So as the states go forward with implementing their challenge processes, we encourage them to continue to respect the primacy of the FCC maps. Bring in additional data that can supplement the map. And there are certainly some certain important things they can do to fine tune. They need to take into account enforceable commitments, where providers have committed to deploy broadband but haven't done it yet. There may be some other fine tuning around and multiple tenant environments, making, where like a single apartment building counts as only one location, but there could be, tons of different apartments. So there are things like that are important parts of getting this right. But ultimately, if states kind of go off and do their own thing that's too divergent from the FCC map, just concerned that we're going to get into a sort of a free for all where there's no common set of data to vet these decisions, and we've put so much effort into developing these maps, that would be a shame to sort of disregard that.
Well, Will, we're kind of running towards the end. We'll give you an opportunity to perhaps have our last word. And if there's also an additional question, I'm not sure if you can see it from Mike Wendy on will access to capital matching letter of credit requirements. This puts a lot of aspects of the BEAD program out of reach of small players, and there's certainly a lot of truth to that. Will, what are your kind of final thoughts for us as we close out this program?
Yeah, I would. This is the call I've been saying to everyone that's willing to listen. If you're working in a state government, there is more than likely some graduate students who would love to work with you to try to actually parse through this data and to try to help you as closely as possible. I've just been suggesting that we're trying to do this in Utah and other states as well, but work with those organizations if you can, because I think it's a key component of all of this, which is that there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of young graduate students who would love to help as much as possible. So there's a lot of work to be done. I feel like, at least on our end, on the academic side, to help buttress what's going on at the state level.
Well, that will have to be our last word as we conclude. I just want to, before I thank our panel, remind you that we're here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time for Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We'll be talking next week about broadband in U.S. territories. We've also just finished up the Made in America Summit, and the videos of that are now available for attendees and Breakfast Club members. And don't miss the pre-registration opportunity for our BEAD Implementation Summit. This is going to be happening on September 21st here in Washington, D.C. You can find out basic information on Broadband Breakfast. On behalf of our three panelists, Michael Darg, Brian Hurley, and Will Reinhart, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you all next week. Take care, everybody.